Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, good morning everyone. My name is Andris Spruts and I am Director of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I am also Professor at Riga University. And today, of course, I have a great pleasure, great delight to see you in such a large numbers. So, of course, I welcome everyone. We have today the book presentation, of the book which is devoted to Western Russian relations. And also we have a discussion on this, and I hope that we will have a very interesting and dynamic debate. We are very grateful to our distinguished foreign Latvian participants for joining us today. But this is not just about today. We have a wider Riga Dialogue process. We have a discussion in May, we have a book, but we like to continue, of course, this whole discussion negotiation sort of in a longer term prospect. A dialogue about international environment and specifically Western Russian relations. International environment, I think, faces considerable degree of unpredictability, insecurity, tension. And conclusions at the Riga Dialogue in May and also in the book that we are facing a couple of minor challenges, if you may say so. We are seeing defining moments in Euro-Atlantic community about the US, about the NATO. Yesterday was a EU large statement, large speech by Mr. Juncker. Relations with Russia are still complicated. And even though there are no anymore, it seems, risks of unmanaged confrontation and conflict, still we can say that new normal, what has been defined, I think it's not necessarily safe. So still there are, of course, challenges. Now we see also here, at least in the Baltic countries, we pay quite close attention to what's happening with military exercises. So Zapad military exercises started just today. So I think it also shows and underlines once more that this is a timely debate. So what to interpret, how to interpret these things, and how we can proceed. Neighborhood remains indispensable. But as Carl Bildt was saying already years ago, sometimes it seems more like a ring of fire rather than a ring of friends. Post-historical nirvana has ended for our region, for Central European region, also for the Baltic Sea region. The history is back to some extent. Great power ambitions are back. Geopolitics are back. But of course, there is also a silver lining. Silver lining, namely, is the deployment of the troops. The NATO deployment of the troops shows solidarity, shows that NATO is viable, that we are pretty much safe and secure and stable, at least for the moment. With Russia, we have deterrence and dialogue. But let's see how it goes, this twin-track policy. So the frank dialogue, in times of uncertainty, it's always timely and important. And as I mentioned, especially in the context of some exercises and some, some of us define as some security dilemma, escalation of the conflict, or at least positioning. The more stakeholders are involved, the better. And of course, that's why dialogue would not be possible without good partners. And today, I'm again very glad, and not just today, say that we have always good partnerships, excellent partnerships, and also for this event, for this book publication, for the wider Riga process, Riga Dialogue process, for the wider discussion on international environment, for our challenges, for discussion on Western Russian relations. We have excellent partnership with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Nuclear Threat Initiative, European Leadership Network, and also company Latvia Dzelzceļš or Latvian Railways. So there is a good combination of everyone. And I'm very delighted, especially to underline and emphasize the role of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We've been here in Latvia for last 25 years together. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has been very instrumental in success and all of those events and discussions and engagement here in Latvia, what has been done by Latvian Institute of International Affairs, but much more importantly, I think Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has contributed first to the intellectual exchange and engagement here in Latvia and different parts of society and think tanks and also governmental institutions. So the informed debate is part of also your contribution, certainly, and I think the regional networking, which is important sort of to widen the scope, is again sort of very much facilitated by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and that's why I'm happy to give the floor to director, to head of the Baltic Friedrich Ebert Stiftung office, Tobias Moschel. Please, Tobias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres, for the very kind words. I would say almost everything is said. Also, the security landscape is always scratched on the plan and on what we are going to discuss. As Andres said, I'm Tobias Mörschel, head of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. Just allow me to say a few words about the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, who we are and why are we here. We are the oldest German political foundation, founded in 1925 already and named after the first democratically elected head of state in Germany, the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert. And right from the beginning, we had three central aims. The one is strengthening democracy, building up democracy. The second aim is fostering international understanding and dialogue. Therefore, we are here and also in 110 other countries worldwide. So we have quite a big of network, which we try to bring together. And the third topic, which I especially want to mention today, is we are giving scholarships to talented young students who are not just clever, but also engage themselves in politics, in society. We have about 2,800 students which get a scholarship from the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. 300 are coming from abroad. So I just want to make here a little bit a kind of commercial break. If you have talented young students who want to study in Germany, they have the chance to get a scholarship by the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. And I'm mentioning this especially today because we have a special committee who is doing the selection of all the people who apply, and 20 members of this committee who are deciding who gets a scholarship of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation are taking part in this conference. And so I'm really delighted to have you here. I'm delighted to have all the excellencies, the members of parliament, you all here. Thank you very much for coming. It's an interesting debate. Thank you very much to Andres, to Leah and all the other cooperation partners for the good cooperation in the last 25 years, for the next 25 years. And now I don't want to rob your time anymore because we have so many interesting topics to debate. Thank you also for the panelists for coming. And now the floor, the table is yours. And I'm really looking forward for this very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Tobias, many thanks for your introduction also once more to the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung. I would like to qualify as a young scholar to get some stipend, but I understand that today my role is still a moderator, and there are a lot of young people inside of the room, and this is once more, of course, invitation, not just to follow this debate, but to participate actively and permanently in this intellectual debate, and to think also about using the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung scholarships in the future. So thanks once more, and now I'm very delighted and happy to come back to our panel. We have a very good panel of distinguished speakers. Some of them also been last year, so we keep this tradition sort of to see what is the progress, how we can assess what has happened during the last year. Of course, I can immediately say that I will try to be strict, even though it's not easy with my colleagues, my friends, to be strict on the time limits, so 7 minutes each. We have very quickly, I go through Reinhard Krumm, who is the head of Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe in Vienna. And you've been contributing also to the book, and you've been contributing to the process. We have Ivan Timofeyev, who is Director of Programs, Russian International Affairs Council. We have excellent cooperation with RIAC, with Russian International Affairs Council already for some time. And Ivan, absolutely, we're happy to have you on board. We have Bruno Lette, Senior Fellow, Security and Defense, General Marshall Fund of the United States. I can also repeat, we have had excellent cooperation in the last years, and sort of to have this transatlantic perspective, also coming from Brussels, and you can certainly, we will be appreciative having this perspective. And last but not least, Imants Liedis. I think I changed a little bit sort of the order. Imants Liedis, who is now ambassador to France, but hold a lot of important positions, being the Foreign Minister of Defense and being the chairman of European Affairs Committee in Latvian Parliament. And again, to add that you've been one of the founding fathers of Riga Dialogue process. So as an ELN member, so of course you've been contributed strongly to this. So I think it's an excellent panel of distinguished speakers. And let's go immediately, Reinhard, to you. Let's start with perhaps wider perspective, how you see it from Vienna. Vienna is head of or center for a hub for OSCE. It's not a NATO country, or Austria. So how it looks from, you can say, more neutral perspective, if you may say so. Please.
Thank you very much, Andres, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a joy to come back, and I mean it. I have lived in Riga. I think I mention this every year, but since the audience changes, I would like to repeat this. I lived from 94 to 96 in Riga, Elisabethesjela 18, not far from here. And it makes quite a difference if one has lived here and work on security issues in Europe. Also would like to add that Mr. Steinmeier maybe is the symbol of how important this is for Germany. He has been in Riga, I think, 7 times during his term as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, the last term, as a matter of fact. And as a president, I think it was one of his first trips to come to Riga. And by the way, he's an FAS scholar, just that you see scholars make a difference. The short presentation I would like to divide into 4 points. The first one is where we are. The second one is the root causes, again, very quickly. The obstacles for solutions, and the fourth one, and then I'm coming definitely back to the OSCE. Are there some initiatives? So where are we today when the Zapad maneuver very close to your border starts? The principles of the European security order under threat. You experience this because you now have NATO soldiers on your soil. Nobody could have thought that 15, 20 years ago. The conflict of Georgia, or in Georgia, in Ukraine, are not the root causes. They're rather the symptoms of a larger crisis, which makes it much more difficult. And one of the reasons is that we have completely, and I have said this before, but it's still the case, different interpretation of the last 25 years, which makes it, again, extremely difficult. What I mean is, since 1991, for some countries it went very well, for others, possibly not that bad either, but the perception is that it went very bad for them. You have, this is a huge difference towards the Cold War, many more stakeholders in the discussion right now. You have many more countries who have their interests, and that makes it much more challenging to find common ground. You have 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership which are unfortunately in a position in between Russia and the EU. And for them, the situation, the status quo, is not good at all. You also have a bipartisan consensus in the US concerning Russia, which we've never seen before. There are reasons for that, but that also makes it difficult to come to any solution. And the last one is something which is even on a bigger orbit, so to speak. The leadership of the EU and the United States of America, the Western model, is also under question by other countries. So this is the status quo we are talking about. What are the root causes of the problem we have besides the small points I gave you? This is my second point. If you look at the Paris Charter of Paris from 1990, which was signed as for a new Europe, so the perspective was fantastic in 1990. One of the sentences, which is very important under the section Friendly Relations among participant states, that at the time was still the Soviet Union, with the ending of the division, and I quote, of Europe, we will strive for a new quality in our security relations while fully respecting each other's freedom of choice in that respect. That's a very clear argument. But also what's written there comes fairly close by, and I quote again, security is indivisible, and the security of every participating state is inseparably linked to that of all others. And here I think we have a fundamental problem where the EU and the United States and other countries look at it, and Russia looks at it. Russia doesn't feel it had a good share in the last 25 years in the European security order. It's a different question if they're right or wrong, but that's just the perception as we have. I don't want to go too much into that because this might be part of the discussion, but the end and the result of all is something we would have not expected in 1990 or even later. It basically means that everyone in Europe feels threatened. Some of the EU countries by Russia, and that's why I mentioned the Zapad exercise which is going on right now. Some of the Eastern European 6, which are the countries of the Eastern Partnership, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, are threatened or feel threatened by Russia. The US by Russia, not militarily, but what we have seen in the election campaign, that was something which clearly was some kind of threat. And on the other way, Russia feels threatened by the US and not by the EU militarily, but possibly economically. So we have a situation which we definitely wanted to have avoided in 1990. So the division of Europe, which we thought we ended in 1990, 1991, is still there, just the division moved eastwards. Unfortunately, I would say we have obstacles for easy solutions. The expert community clearly comes up with ideas, and I come to some of those later on. But in politics, you see one obstacle which one former defense secretary under the W. Bush administration pointed out, and I quote again, "Every time NATO makes a move or Russia makes a move near a border, there is a response. Where does that all stop? So there is a need to stop that downward spiral. The dilemma is, how do you do that without handing Putin, the Russian president, a victory of huge proportions? How do you come out of this situation, on the one hand, saving your position, face saving, on the other hand side, come up with something which is fundamentally progressive and is interesting for everybody, no second-hand solutions? For some countries, the status quo is manageable. In other words, the hope to come up with the Helsinki 2 is a nice idea, and it's nice to discuss that, but not really anybody is going for that. Not the US, not Russia, and most of the EU countries neither. The problem is that the status quo for the countries in between, which I have mentioned, is not sustainable. It's not good, especially for Ukraine. If we think that Ukraine might end up as a frozen or protected conflict, is a huge mistake. Ukraine is too big for that. What can happen in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Abkhazia, these are frozen conflicts, might possibly work, neither for the population clearly, but it might work. For Ukraine, it won't work. So these elements makes it extremely difficult to come up with any idea, and of course, the Riga Dialogue is wrecking its brain to come up with something, and there are many more conferences doing that. I think the Riga Dialogue is going on a very good path because we have different opinions. So we have to quarrel. There is no solution which everybody is very happy with. This won't happen because the stakes are too high. So I'm not going to say anything about midterm or long term, because I think one should divide policy into short, mid, and long term. But I would like to say, and I have 1 minute and I'll finish, is the short term, and the question was about the OSCE in Vienna. One thing the OSCE is doing, they're looking for small steps. They're looking for islands of cooperation as short term. And one of those things is the so-called structured dialogue, which has started this year. A structured dialogue means that you're just talking, because we would like to emphasize, again, we need dialogue, but dialogue about what? The dialogue, the structured dialogue, is something which you start, and each participant state in the OSCE community is 57 states, even though this subject is not all interesting for all of them, is to come up with subjects, and this is perception of the last 25 years. This is the military doctrine, and the third is military posture. So what are you having on the ground, and what are you willing to do with your military equipment? And on these three subjects, the OSCE, including the United States of America, including Russia, including countries like Latvia, are willing to work on as the first step to somehow come up with some trust. And I think this is the idea, what we should look for. There are no big solutions, as I have said before. It's the small steps, what we can do fairly soon to come up with something which gives us the chance to also add, as we did during the Cold War, detente to deterrence. I think deterrence-wise, we're doing fairly well. We're not so good doing on the detente side. Thank you very much.
Reinhard, thanks, many thanks as always for your, on one hand, overwhelming. You give me 1 minute now, so I have to be short. For this overwhelming and comprehensive view, but at the same time sort of also specifically going into the what are the challenges and the prospects or ways of negotiating or having a dialogue with Russians or Russia. You partly touched upon this, you partly responded to this, but still I would ask it a little bit in different way. During our Riga Dialogue May meeting, one of the ideas, one of the, in a sense, criticism about a European or Euro-Atlantic, pan-European, European continental security system was that actually there is a lack of efficient, overarching institution. The OSCE doesn't really fulfill those criteria. Would you agree with that statement? Would you say that there is a need for this? Would you say that it's a normal and natural because it's a result of fundamental differences between sides involved? Or vice versa? This would be an important precursor actually to start a dialogue and to start sort of putting together things and to harmonize them. So how you look at this OSCE aspect or overarching institutional aspect in Europe, which is lacking or not lacking? Please.
Thank you. The OSCE is very easily to criticize because it was not on the radar for the last maybe 10 years. It came up again because of the Ukraine crisis. The OSCE is also a synonym for the organization of sipping coffee in Europe. So, as I said, it's easy to criticize the OSCE, and there are ideas to come up with a new organization. The thing is, there are no times to come up with anything new. There wouldn't be any minimal dominator to come up with anything. We have the OSCE. The OSCE is as strong as the countries within. So if Russia is interesting to come up with something, they could use the OSCE. If they don't want to come up with anything, they don't use it. And Russia is very much looking into bilateral talks. They're doing this with the EU also. We have a new general, well, not we, but yeah, actually we, because we're all members of the OSCE. There is a new general secretary in Austria, Mr. Gremminger, who headed the OSCE during the Ukraine crisis, because then Switzerland was chairing the OSCE in 2014. I think Mr. Gremminger understands fairly well all the flaws there are, but I think he's willing, and he gets more support by the countries, as far as I understand him, to try to make the OSCE, as I said, as an example, the structured dialogue, to make it a platform to discuss. The OSCE is no organization to implement anything, but it is the organization where everybody put its signature under. Russia didn't leave that organization to come up with some ideas. You might say this is very little in these turbulent times, but it is, at the moment it's the best we have, because it is the organizations, and I'm sorry to repeat this because mostly of you know it, where all the countries are members. Azerbaijan is a member, Belarus, Russia, the United States, Latvia, they're all members. It's not the EU, it's not NATO. We don't have a different one. So I think it depends on the countries. And my feeling is, after many talks with the OSCE in Vienna, that the countries are trying and are thinking, why not use it? It doesn't really hurt.
Excellent, Reinhard. Thank you so much. Let's proceed. Ivan, we are very happy to have a Russian perspective. Are we continuously sipping coffee, or is there a chance to still agree on something? Please.
Thank you very much, Andres, and I'm very grateful for this invitation to Riga. And RIAC values a lot this cooperation, and in the time we have now, it's of special importance to run such a conversation in a blunt and candid manner. So I would like to catch a ball from your side and to elaborate on your point, which you made at the beginning, that now an unmanaged confrontation is hardly possible. This is a good news, and well, I would agree with this. And if you take Zapad trainings as an example, there are lots of speculations in the press now, especially in the West, especially here in the Baltic states, and this, let's say, noise, media noise, can be well understood. We have similar media noise when there are NATO trainings, but the trainings, both from Russia and NATO sides, are quite transparent. They are usually done within Vienna document. There are necessary briefing conducted. So it is a problem in terms of our relations which reflect their quality, that there is still a security dilemma, that we still have a need for military training, or we perceive that we have a need. So this is a symptom, but at the same time we can state that it is more or less manageable, that it will not be some sort of a surprise out of the box thing. Recently we have published a month ago a report on the formula of Euro-Atlantic security in Moscow. And one of the key points is that in current conditions it would be naive to hope to have a partnership between Russia and the West in terms of security, a full-fledged partnership, I mean. But so we should understand that by now there is not enough interests, political will, and even values to have such a partnership and to implement what we were fixing in 1990. But we should choose between different evils the best one. And the best one at this point is to maintain stable deterrence between Russia and the West in terms of security. So what do I mean by stable deterrence? It's a situation when we have to contain each other in a military sense, and when our politicians afford themselves arrogant rhetorics to each other, okay, but at the same time we are more or less predictable to each other on meal-to-meal level in terms of military expenditures, in terms of important military steps. That is a very important thing for a current situation. There are many problems in a way to maintain stable deterrence. In terms of balance of power and security regimes, it is not the worst problem. So these things are more or less manageable. But they are less manageable in the new spheres, like cyber. So there are no rules of the game, and it's easy to manipulate this sphere, and let's say it increases uncertainty. We have huge problems in the media. So post-true era, with all of the, let's say, uncontrolled and uncontrolled dynamics in social networks, which, let's say, make an official position quite absurdist. And of course, conflicts. We have Ukrainian one, Syrian one, which has its own dynamics and which may create, which may make both Russia and NATO and NATO members hostages of the conflict dynamics. So, if I address the topic of the meeting, so what is the changing Euro-Atlantic security landscape, so I would stress several important things. That now the dynamics is not so rapid as it used to be a couple of years ago. So now we are on a sort of a plateau. And this is more or less good because we can more or less manage the situation. There are some signs to the better. One of the signs is the improvement in Syria due to conflict security zones, and they seem to be quite well maintained by Russians, Americans, and others. The military dynamics in Syria is now becoming more clear. There is a ground for further progress on Syrian issue, and this is a moderate. This makes me moderately but optimistic. The second optimistic sign is the opportunity to discuss the issue of peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, which may be a landmark, and lots will depend on what we have as a result of this discussion. But there are also some negative signs. U.S. Sanctions bill is a negative thing because it's very overwhelming. It covers different points beyond Ukraine and Syria. And at some point, it's a hard issue because sanctions imply economic benefit for the United States, and this violates international law. And of course, Europeans are quite unhappy with this. But all in all, if we make a balance of the dynamics, there is a chance that we may make a small step forward to shrink the deterrence too. So to move from the scenario of stable deterrence to shrinking deterrence. Thanks.
Thank you, Ivan, for the Russian perspective. As my task is a little bit to stretch the argument and to look at from different sides, I would have a question, a follow-up question on a year. Which year are we now? What do I mean by this? Sergei Karaganov, at the beginning of the year, he actually wrote that we are now in 1815. Andrei Kortunov, in this book, says we are 1939. 1815 is European concert, and basically that there's convergence of interest. 1939 is a sitting war, which finishes with what it finishes. Which year are we now?
2017. Yeah, because, well, both Andrei and Sergei, they are very sophisticated in history. And there is always a temptation for historians to make, let's say, parallels with the past. I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist, and I'm doing IR, so I'm less inclined to do this. So we are living in a very unique moment. Of course, history may be repeated as a farce, but we should deal with the problem as we have it now. We are living in a completely different world.
Okay, Ivan, even though, of course, I could ask, what is the prospect of the... Which direction are we
but
moving?
I understand your issue, because whether we are on what kind of bifurcation do we have now? Will we have war tomorrow, or will we have some period of long stability tomorrow, like we had after the European concert? Well, to be frank, I have strong concern about the risk of deterioration of situation. So I mentioned the possibility of minor improvements, but at the same time, I think that the probability to get into unstable deterrence and even to conflict, local conflict, is still very high. Is still very high. So that's why it's so important to maintain, let's say, communication at our level, on official level. And this deterioration may be due to simple misinterpretations and misunderstandings of each other. So so not 1939, but yeah.
Even you navigated perfectly, because I think it was a tricky question for you to choose between the two excellent sort of respected Russian experts. Thank you. Let's proceed. Bruno, the perspective from Brussels. So what is EU and NATO thinking about the Western-Russian interaction and engagement?
Sure. Well, many things, for sure. And pleasure to be here again, Andres. Thank you very much for the invitation. I always like to say that my very first boss at GMF was actually Ronald Asmus. That's almost like a decade ago. And he actually really did infect me, if I can put it this way, with his passion and love for the Baltics. So very, very happy to be here. Now, talking from Brussels' perspective, first, I would perhaps like to say this. I think what we need to perhaps address first is this mental picture that we often have in the West about Russia being a confident, assertive aggressor that is doing so very successfully. Russia is not that confident, neither is it always that successful. I don't want to make the overall balance of its foreign policy, but I would say it's not necessarily positive. Add to this a mix of low energy prices, failing economics, and a diminishing demographics, and you will see that Russia actually is a country with a lot of uncertainties. We have our own uncertainties, but so do the Russians. And I think it's very important to understand that if we talk about Western-Russian relations. Now, the European Union, NATO, of course, there are many overlapping interests with the Russians, of course. But there's, of course, the disagreements. And these disagreements is what fuels the tensions and the mutual distrusts. I don't like to say it, but I do believe that perhaps Western-Russian relations are at their lowest point since the end of the Cold War. I think that's just very simple because both sides see each other as the principal threat to their security, from both sides. From a Brussels or Washington perspective, this crystallizes in a scenario where Russia will continue to fuel the crisis in Ukraine, will continue to fuel the frozen conflicts, where it's Moldova or Georgia, and where basically we perceive a more or less predictable buildup of military forces, Russian military forces, stretching from the Arctic to East Europe, to the Black Sea, to the Eastern Mediterranean. An iron arch, if I can put it this way. So of course we don't like to see this. And in this regard, the West, Brussels, Washington, faces a conundrum vis-à-vis Moscow. On the one hand, we feel the need to respond to this, what we call military provocation, escalation. We have to respond to this. But on the other hand, we also feel the need for dialogue and conversation because the military trends today are very worrying. And this is really, like the first speaker stressed, a conundrum that is unsolvable for the moment. How do we do this? And in my opinion, this is the real strategic problem in Russian-Western relations today. It's not the perspective of or threat of immediate war. It is the perspective of a down spiral of the militarization of our relationship. So we need to see how to address that. And I do salute those, both in the Western side, but also on the Russian side, that call for dialogue and conversation. But it's a bit of a caricature to think you can have a serious conversation while at the same time both sides are piling up tanks, jet fighters, and soldiers at their border. So this is something that we need to look at. Force reduction, in my opinion, is key. But how do you do force reduction? I think force reduction is certainly a necessity on the Russian side. But then it's also understandable that perhaps the Russians don't want to do so because they expect then from us more security guarantees. And I want to talk a little bit about those security guarantees, because what are these security guarantees? Western thinking on force reduction and security guarantees are largely based on models from the 1990s. Think about the CFE treaty, the INF treaty, the Budapest Memorandum, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, I mean, name it. Those are all constructions from the 1990s that do no longer perhaps respond to current day's needs when it comes to security. But with what do we replace this then, of course? That's the big question. I don't want to argue who's wrong, who's right, who started all this. That's not what I want to do. I just observe that current relations are in a deadlock. And if we continue to go down this road, both Russia and the West, I don't see an immediate prospect for better relations. And perhaps my last point, Andres, if you allow me 1 more minute. Our strength, Western strength vis-à-vis Russia is our unity. The fact that Western countries are able to make a united front is what gives us an advantage, or at least a strength at the negotiation table. Our unity has always been the prime target of Russian efforts. That's what Russia tries to destroy. So we need to protect it, we need to cherish it. And so beyond only seeking constructive dialogue vis-à-vis Russia, I think also the internal dimension of Western unity is important. We need to continue cultivating this understanding within our own community as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you for this informed Brussels perspective. You started your presentation actually saying that Russia is not that self-confident and that strong as sometimes we think or we sort of perceive it. Neither do us, neither do we. So that also the European Union and NATO has its challenges. Actually, one of the conclusions or one of the assessments in this book is that we both are weak and we have quite a number of weaknesses. Actually, in this book, there is the idea that the weakness is a good thing because of our weakness, we are pushed together to cooperate on global arena. What is your assessment? Is a weakness actually the source of hope, or vice versa? The weakness actually facilitates conflict.
Well, weakness also generates a lot of uncertainty, and this is indeed, you know, how I started my presentation. Tricky question again, Andris. You know, it's I salute you for that again. Look, I will just repeat what I said. We need to find a way to create confidence in each other's. But then also I agree with what you said. The prospect to do so is kind of unreal, at least in the short or midterm prospect. You know, I would say if you make the overall balance of how Brussels perceive Moscow, it's not necessarily the image of an enemy. It's more the image of an adversary. And I think that it's a big difference there. I mean, so basically, when you have, because this is, I think, what we have with Russia, it's competition. It's competition with a very able and uncertain competitor. So how do you move beyond that? So there is hope, because I don't think that the real way we look at Russia is as an enemy, at least not in Brussels. Maybe that's a tricky thing to say here. But you know, how do we basically move beyond this mental picture and create more confidence in each other? That's going to be the big challenge, I believe. Okay.
Thank you, Bruno. Imants, as a ELN member, the member of the group which facilitates some interaction and engagement and diversity of views, and also, of course, with the Latvian perspective, how it looks from your side. So if you already seen and heard other opinions and assessments, please.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks, Andris, for inviting me along again this time round. And it's really a pleasure to be engaged in the process of trying to arrange a dialogue between European, American, and Russian partners. And yes, a quick advertisement for the European Leadership Network, of which I've been a member for about 5 years now. They do a lot of work behind the scenes with Igor Ivanov, Wolfgang Ischinger, Des Brown, and Sam Nunn. So, and there will, you know, I just heard yesterday that there will be another meeting held in London, again, below the radar. And these are very important for Latvia. I think it's very important to maintain this opportunity for dialogue, which is not always necessarily visible, but does take place. And I think from the Latvian perspective, we've just sent a new ambassador to Moscow, and I think this is an important signal for Russia, because Maris Rieksniņš has been a Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's been a long-serving diplomat in the Foreign Ministry, and I think this is also an opportunity that should be perceived as being the case in Moscow. At the same time, it's right that when he departed, in one of his interviews, he said that he has no illusions, because, of course, the role of the diplomat is to keep open the avenues of communication, but whether anything will actually change, that's not necessarily something that can be so easily achieved by ambassadors. So, having said that, I think that the general situation, as I've perceived it, is that at the moment, a lot seems to depend on the dynamics of the important players in the international scene. Having had the great privilege to be in Paris for the last year and a half, I have seen how important the election of a new president of France has been, both internally for the country, but for Europe, and also on the international scene. One of the first things that he did was to invite President Putin, President Trump to Paris, even though it was quite clear that there are differences of opinion between the partners. And I think this is something that we should all learn from, that it's very important to speak very clearly with partners and to say what you mean and mean what you say. And I think that this is also something that the Riga Dialogue is about, even though that's on a different level, of course. So the players involved are very important on the governmental level. Whether the efforts that are being made below the radar, Riga Dialogue, ELN, NTI, also the Russian International Affairs Council, whether these efforts filter through to the top is also something which is a question and which often needs to be considered. But one never knows when the dynamics play into in a beneficial way, so that the leaders do hear what's coming from their advisors. So keep the communication channels open. This is something that Ivan mentioned, and I think we fully agree with that. It's very important to, and that is obviously, despite the differences of opinion, I think it was right, clearly after 2014 and the occupation of Crimea and the military activities on behalf of Russia in Ukraine, it was right to take a pause, because there needed clear signals to be sent at that stage. I disagree with Ivan when he said that the question of sanctions violate international law. You mentioned something like that. I think the question of violation of international law relates more to the end of the system that we knew it post end of Cold War, and the way in which treaties and agreements were thrown into the bin as a result of or by Russia's actions in Ukraine. And this is still very much, I think, the key to how we will move ahead. And you're right in mentioning that the proposal about a UN engagement in Ukraine may be a window of opportunity. Window of opportunity was a phrase used by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France in June of this year in an article in Le Monde, where he perceived that that there are possibilities to move ahead in the relations with Russia, and specifically noting Syria as being one of those issues. Ukraine, I mean, is a very difficult challenge, ongoing challenge, and I think that the parties involved, Latvia supports very much the Normandy format, need to look at what is being proposed by Russia and what the details are of what's on the table. So I see that my time has gone by, and let me end on also a positive note, which is what Bruno referred to, and that's the question of unity. And I think it has been very important. Western unity since 2014 has been maintained, both on the sanctions point of view within the European Union and with the United States of America. And I think obviously for Latvia, being part of that unified approach is extremely important, and it's important for Latvia to have this unity maintained, along with keeping open avenues for dialogue. Thank you.
Iman, thanks for this wider perspective, but also the Baltic and Latvian perspective. I would like to have a short follow-up question as well on sort of two aspects interconnected. You finished with Western unity issue. You started your article with prospect of normalization. So what are exactly expectations from the Western side to normalize relations with Russia? So what must be criteria? What are those expectations? What are those conditions, in a sense, for the Western unity, what we would expect from Russia to go ahead?
Well, I mean, I'll quote one of the sentences that I used in the book, in my article in the book, and it's a quote of the political director of the Foreign Ministry of Latvia when he said, and I quote, as long, this is Andris Pelsch, as long as Russia's goal is to destroy the West's value system and international legal order, it is not possible to normalize relations. Having reflected on that a little bit, coming over from Paris yesterday, it may be too strict an assessment. I mean, I think that it is possible to chew gum and walk, as I think one of the ELN members, Ian Kearns, once said. We will obviously have to bear in mind what is perceived to be Russia's goal about West's value system and regrettably the efforts post-1991 to engage with Russia and treat them as a partner who could join that value system. 2014 and Ukraine really destroyed that. So I think once again the key to moving ahead really must be related to events in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Imants. Any reactions from the distinguished panelists? If not at the moment, I'm happy to open the floor. Please, and I can see Attis is immediately ready to shoot.
Yes, Attis Lynch, I just came. Our session at the Latvian Parliament ended quite early, so that's why I could come. I'm involved in the OSCE, and let me ask you thinkers, what do I do? I'm a member of the Latvian delegation. In the OSCE, both in Tbilisi and in Minsk, just recently, we passed very strong resolutions that the OSCE should be able to send observers to Georgia, okay? And Russia has vetoed that. And not only that, there are no UN observers there either. They're out too. There is an EU monitoring mission, but they're only allowed on the Georgian side. The Russians will not allow them to cross the occupation line. So how long can this go on? Now we're going to have an MB8 meeting on Monday in Vilnius, and we will take this issue up again in Andorra when we have our next OSCE meeting. So what happens there? We pass another resolution, or what then? Now this is really, is this sipping coffee?
Thank you, Attis.
Can't drink too much coffee, not good for your health.
Thank you, Attis. Please, some other questions. Let's have a round of questions. Please. Yes, Mr. President.
I have a question to Ivan Timofeyev. We all remember in 2008, Conventional Forces Europe Treaty was just, as said, thrown into the bin. And that was done by the Russian side. And the argument by President Putin was that nobody from outside is going to control the movements of armed forces in the Russian territory. At the same time, in NATO-Russia Council, in Bucharest meeting, he said that Russia is ready to create a new treaty. Is this ability, or it's a possibility and capability still present in the Russian administration?
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Yes, please, over there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben Heap from the NATO Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence. Excellent discussion this morning, and very positive as well, I thought, and the talk of dialogue, excellent, thank you. My question is, there was talk of face saving and prestige, and this idea that the Russian Federation lost out, post-1990, and felt that its place in the international system wasn't quite as recognised as it should be. When we talk about prestige and honour and face saving in this context, is that restoration a realistic prospect? And if it is, what do you see the trajectory as being to get to the stage where Russia, feels that it is recognised, that it is somehow got to that stage where it is accepted as a world player? Is that realistic? And if so, what's the trajectory to get there? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, if not immediately questions, we can come back to the panelists, please. I think we start with sipping coffee, and what should the OSCE delegations must do.
I understand the frustration of the parliamentary group of the OSCE, sending peacekeepers to Georgia and towards the Ukraine. I mean, in Ukraine you have observers of the OSCE on the ground, and they're doing, I would say, fantastic work. I understand the frustration, but the idea at the moment at the OSCE is, and you know this perfectly well because you're involved, is the structured dialogue. As I pointed out, it has something to do with perceptions, and this has something to do with prestige, with the military might which is on the ground, and the strategies of military strategy of the countries. This dialogue is going, I think, for 9 months now, and it's still going, which is a great success. Nobody expected that. The idea, this is coming back to a resolution of the OSCE in Hamburg at the last ministerial meeting in 2016. This is just the first step to do something. I mean, the idea is to talk about arms reduction. All the trust-building measure, confidence-building measures is all connected to arms reduction. And as somebody pointed out on the panel, it is very much needed, but there is very little going on because all the treaties, somebody else mentioned it, the CFE and others, are not working. So we can lament on this panel saying, nothing is working out. There is something going on in the OSCE with the structured dialogue. It will take time. What has been destroyed since 1991 is not that easily built up again. And the frustration is on all sides. What has happened in Ukraine is one of the major events in post-Cold War history in Europe. But if we start the timeline in 2005 or 6 or 7, which is usually done by the speech of Mr. Putin in Munich, this is only part of the truth. You have to go back from 91 to 2007. And then you see, like it or not, we can argue constantly that the Russians don't have a point, but they perceive it that way. If we think, that's my opinion, this is going over your question, but it includes another question about the face saving. If we think that the rule-based international order we thought we had after 1991 can be restored like that, it won't happen. And the work we have to do is, and I think you're very, very right with that, to find the zeitgeist, which means to have the right arguments at the same time. You cannot organize that. But we have to work at it. And I think your frustration with the OSCE is shared by many. But I just want to come back to, and I'm an historian, it's easy to come back to history. You can never repeat history, I understand. But certain ideas you can get. 1963, and I think this speech has been quoted from Kennedy. 1963, this is right after Cuba, and it's right after the building of the Berlin Wall. And I can imagine that especially only 18 years after the end of the Second World War, this must have been an incredible frustrating time. Possibly worse than today. There were ideas to come up with major ideas to change this. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Gabriel, a week ago had a speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was talking about the change of trajectory. Meaning, as I said before, on the deterrent side, we're doing very well. But we're not doing so well, and I'm repeating my words, on the other side. And this does not mean we go to Moscow or Moscow comes to us and we talk. Talking alone is nothing. What do we want to talk about? And I think this is what we have to work on. Because the stakes are still high. For the last, I'm finished in a sec. For the last 25 years, Russia was not more or less included in world politics. We thought Russia is gone in 91, 92, 93, for possibly good reason, because it was extremely weak. But that has never been the case in world history, that Russia was kind of gone. Now they're back. So what do we do? And I have no answer to your question about the face savings. I mean, this is clearly a question for our Russian participant. That's hard work to come up with something. But the result cannot be that we say, oops, we made a mistake. So the comparison with the Cold War is always easy, and there are books out, Cold War 2.0. It's not really helpful. This is a different situation. And the main difference is that we come from a very, very positive development in the last 25 years. When during the Cold War, it was partly going up, but we had major hiccup, like the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1968 and the invasion of the Soviet Union of Afghanistan in 1979. But somehow the policy went on with a very hard deterrence, but with a very meaningful work on detente.
Thank you. Imants?
I don't think that talking is nothing, which is what you've just said, Reinhard. Just talking is nothing. I totally disagree. I mean, okay, talking for talking's sake, yes, but okay, that's fine. But I just want to continue on the question about the face saving and the prestige. I mean, I think partners of Russia, and we're all partners of Russia, are actually making steps towards face saving and creating opportunities for this so-called face saving to take place. And I mean, I'm not convinced that Russia has necessarily lost its prestige. I think Russia, the size of Russia, will always be regarded with certain reverence. The importance of Russia as a member of the Security Council will not go away for us, a neighbor of ours. And as a result of that, I'm not convinced that we, either Latvia, Europe, or the West, do not regard Russia as a player. And that, on the one hand, is good, but on the other hand, it's it's a negative aspect because how does the player play? I think that's created the problems since 2014. Certainly, maintaining this question of respect and trust, seeking a restoration of trust is important. And as I mentioned, I think keep the dialogue, the avenues for dialogue open. And I think by having invited President Putin to Versailles, the French President Macron was very much making an opening and showing the importance of the President of Russia as a player.
Thank you, Imants. Bruno?
Oops. No, I mean, look, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was given all the tools to be a world player and to have prestige. A seat at the G8, part of the United Nations Security Council, NATO created its NATO-Russia Council, the European Union offered a partnership, Russia was involved in the World Trade Organization process. So, it was given that. There's only one thing we did not give to the Russians. And that was a system, what we insisted on was a system of sovereign states, and not a system of states that have a patronage towards Moscow. So, I think that, I'm not sure that prestige and face-saving is the first thing that Russia seeks. I think it's just power and influence that Russia seeks. Power and influence that serves the interests of a few people around the president. And that's it.
Bruno, strong words. Ivan?
Just to catch a ball from you, Bruno, I would refer to Graham Allison, one of the founding fathers of American science on decision making, and one of his favorite questions was, what is the United States of America? What is the Soviet Union? When we say Soviet Union wants this or that, what is Soviet Union? Is it Brezhnev? Or is it a political elite? Or is it a communist party? Or is it a society? Or is it a decision maker A or decision maker B? So this question shows that the situation about intentions and strategies is a bit more complicated. But the problem is here. Now let me address a question about CFE and conventional arms. And I would start with disagreement with your position on the point that it was Russia which put the treaty to the bin. The story is a bit more complicated. Conventional CFE is one of the backbones of Russian NATO founding act of 1997. So it is fixed there that the treaty guarantees for us confidence, and it is correlated. Well, it is implied by the act that it is correlated with the sovereign right of each state in Europe to choose alliances. So, as far as we have guarantees in terms of treaty which make us confident in each other, we are free and we are okay with any country choosing their alliance. What happened next? 1999. We got an adopted CFE. Who have subscribed this treaty? Adopted one. Russia, Ukraine, paradoxically, Kazakhstan, and, correct me if I'm wrong, Belarus. No NATO member has signed the adopted CFE. And you know better than I do. You follow the Baltic states policy in a much more focused way. But as far as I remember, the position of the Baltic states was quite negative about the subscription of the adopted CFE. So I wouldn't share the view that it was only Russia which put the treaty to the bin. It was at least it was put to the bin collectively, and that was a serious hit to the European security. So we missed one of the key achievements of the end of the Cold War, because the history doesn't know the subjective mood, and we shouldn't judge in terms of if. But my feeling is that if we, both Russia and NATO, if we could save CFE, we won't have a Ukrainian crisis. We won't have a Ukrainian crisis. Now about the prospects of new conventional arms regulations. There was an initiative of Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and I think it was quite reasonable, and it was a good sign in conditions we had that time, and I had the chance personally to meet Federal Minister in Yekaterinburg when he, at the time when he proposed that idea. But we cannot. Again, my feeling is that we cannot get back to the treaty as we had it at the beginning of 1990s, in 1992. We have new technological realities. We have new military realities. So it is not just tanks, artillery, and you name all of the nomenclature of the arms which are fixed there. We now have more sophisticated weapons. We now have unmanned aircraft. So in terms of technologies, the treaty, if we want to have it, should be completely different. It should take into account the new technological reality, a new political reality also. So I think that this is my personal view, but I'm afraid that no conventional treaty comparable to the one we had in early 1990s, and even comparable to the adopted one of 1999, is possible now. So if you really want, if you have a political will from both sides to have it, from both sides, and there should be a consensus in NATO about it, because there are very different opinions within NATO about conventional arms. So if we really want it, we can achieve it via, let's say, minor steps. We could think about regional, sub-regional security regimes, more flexible, for instance, for Baltic region, for Baltic region, more flexible, but at the final point, we could, let's say, collect a new CFE as a Lego construct, theoretically.
Ivan, thank you, but I still would like to sort of have a short follow-up what was ask about the face-saving prestige
Very
image.
brief.
What exactly, I asked Imants, what exactly we expect from Russia to normalize relationship? What Russia expects from the West to somehow go ahead?
I have fixed a very brief answer, which is not an answer actually, which is a fact that this issue is very hard to manage. Balance of power or security regime or CFE is something we can rationally discuss. We know what we can understand each other. We know what it is. In terms of face saving is very fluid thing. What is safe saving? What is face? What do we understand by this? So it's a very fluid and hardly manageable thing, and I think we should go on more stable grounds.
Did you expect something from us, from the West?
Yes. I should be more rather tactical than strategic. Let's take this.
Just be frank.
Yeah, and frank.
Yes.
Let's take this peacekeeping initiative. Russia would lose a face if the initiative is rejected by the West by definition. But if it is being discussed, there may be concessions from both sides. From our side, from your side, finally we may have a compromise. If there is an equal negotiation, if there are mutual concessions, if there is a compromise, then face will be safe for everyone. So this is a tactical but important example.
Okay, thank you. So let's have another round of questions, comments, please. I think let's use opportunity that we have a distinguished group of people. Yes, please, over there. Very good.
Good day. I heard two major points
Just
come out.
please introduce yourself. And
Oh, I'm sorry. Nathan Colvin from the United States. I heard two major points about cohesion inside of the alliance, and I'm sure internally inside of Russia as well, it's equally as important, and also the rise of social technologies. So I'm just wondering, what are the impacts of those social technologies on cohesion? Are they playing a role? Are they contributing to the rise of things like populism, nationalism, and maybe even a decrease in the potency of the state system? And if so, how does that apply to security cooperation as we move forward in that kind of operating environment?
okay, thank you. Please, some other questions.
Hi, my name
Oh, yes,
is
please.
Alexei Zivashuk. I finished my master's in Canada, specializing in US foreign policy toward Russia. Worked for US government, a bit for NATO, lately for Thomson Reuters. My question, I really liked Bruno's comment on unity needed when facing Russia. And there's a question that popped up in my mind. I don't think it's from my view, it's not so much the issue of unity for Russia that the European Union would have. I think for Russians, it's more, without naming countries, but it's more the issue within that unity. There's a dynamic, there's relations, and there's one particular member dominating that has less things to lose if relations were to deteriorate between, say, Russia and the European Union. I think, and lately in the news, we've been reading about the issue of natural gas, and that issue came out there. So I wonder if you could just comment on that. Is there, like, dynamics problem there, or would you say no, though there is actually no problem, and what would you say? Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes. No questions. Everybody wants to read the book and solve all the issues. I can just add in this case, of course, I would have a lot of questions to add, but since we are really running out of time, and as I think it is actually a good idea to leave also some ideas and some insights, sort of some feedback from the reading of the book. Perhaps a very simple questions to Reinhard and also to Ivan about elections. Next year we have elections in Russia, presidential elections, of course. And we have just in a few weeks' time elections in Germany. The one part of the question would be, should we expect anything, any improvement of relationship before elections? I think it's a little bit naive. I think we should actually wait for this with Russia, Western Russia. And second, could we expect that something sort of can happen, or what would be trajectory after elections? We are the same, or this is sort of some kind of window of opportunity when everything is settled, when the dust has settled, so we finally can start to have a, you can say, from positions of the strengths, a dialogue, because then the political process or no domestic, you can say, resentments and grievances and the sources sort of interaction are not that important anymore, and we can sort of stick finally to compromise and diplomacy. Please. So let's come back to the question of cohesion. Another question and these ones. Please. Let's start in a reverse order. Imans, I know.
Well, then I'll just pick up on your last question.
Yes, please.
Because it's interesting. I don't think the question of whether the Russian approach will change before the elections is really an issue. One can anticipate on, the experience of the last elections in Russia that they will not meet the OSCE standards of being free and fair and democratic. And having said that, I think there will be sort of a continuity. I think that it'll be other dynamics and not necessarily the elections that may well influence how the Russian approach to the relationship with the West will develop. I would today probably say that one can predict the outcome of the German elections just as one can predict the outcome of the Russian elections. Yeah. So in anticipation of that, I think Europe certainly is awaiting the results of the elections in Germany to be able to move ahead. The dynamic within Europe has completely changed since prior to the elections in France, where the nightmare scenarios of Le Pen and a continuation of Brexit, Trump, Putin, and all these other issues that were really making the security situation unstable, certainly from the Latvian perspective. We're now in a totally different situation where we're expecting the Chancellor to be re-elected, stability in Germany, minor detail about who will be in the coalition. It will take a little time to organize the coalition probably, but the issue, and of course I'm speaking slightly from the French prism, is the motor, the French-German motor, reforms, defense security, proposals already on the table on the defense front. There are economic issues that are on the table concerning the Eurozone. And there is hope and optimism now that was not present in Europe at the beginning of this year. So I think that these elections do play an important role, as we've seen.
Thank you, Imans. Bruno?
I'll just answer the question that was addressed to me. Don't take unity for granted, first of all. If you look at the past decade that we've been seeing, it's actually fascinating times. Very challenging, but fascinating. Over the past decade, the European Union had to face a financial crisis, a euro crisis, a migration crisis, a terrorism crisis. But we're still standing. The European Union seems more or less to get out of this valley now and rise up again, at least if I have to believe the words of our dear President of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker. But all those dynamics that you are referring to really had or have still fertile grounds to erode the ability of the European Union to show a united face. We should not underestimate this trend. And on the NATO front, the same. NATO today has to do much more than just to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. The alliance now has to do many different things at the same time, whether it's deterrence, crisis management, adapting to the new technological changes that you mentioned, and even engaging now in unscattered waters in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Levant. So again, yes, unity, but there are many dynamics that have the potential to erode this unity. That's why we need to keep working on understanding.
Thank you. Ivan?
Thank you, Andres. Very important question about social technologies. A brief comment on this. I think we should be very careful in, let's say, our confidence of the control over the social dynamics we have now. And Brexit, the victory of Mr. Trump in the United States, which was a surprise, is in evidence. So we think that we have an impact that some country may affect this, another country may affect that, but the reality is that things are much more complicated. And Reinhard mentioned at the beginning of this session a very important word from Hegel, zeitgeist. So we shouldn't have an illusion that we control zeitgeist. Elections in Russia and Germany, of course, it's hard to anticipate that something serious happens before elections, well, due to obvious reasons, but the next electoral cycle, next 4 plus 6 years, may be a time of transition. So I think that we should anticipate something by 2022 to 2024, and it will depend on us also what should we have as a result, because those bricks in this future wall are also built by us.
Okay. Thank you, Ivan. And Reinhard, last but not least,
One question to unity. I mean, unity is an instrument to achieve something. And so far, the unity works. All the countries are within, and there is no sign that this will change. There are always discussions about it, but at the moment, the unity is on, the sanctions are on, the European sanctions, I mean. And that works out fine. There's no reason. And the American ones, yes, that's true, but that's a different story. The European ones are the good ones. And concerning elections in Russia, well, Timofeyev has said something to that. On the German elections, well, the FES is close to the social democracy, so I cannot stand here or sitting here and saying, yeah, it's all gone. I'll keep it with our candidate. Election is open. But it doesn't really matter who wins concerning the questions about security in Russia. It will stay the same. Germany has a foreign policy which for the last decades has been going into one direction. I think there is no reason for any allied country to complain about Russia. We are there, about Germany, I'm sorry. We are there, and we are supporting all this. And the new foreign minister might change in nuances some policy, but in general, Germany is there because, and I'm sure you have heard this, but I just want to repeat it because it's important. For Germany, the EU is not a project which we sometimes support or not. The European Union is part of the German DNA, basically. This is it. This is the lesson for Germany. So we will do everything. It doesn't matter of the government. Of course, you can argue, well, what about the alternative for Germany? That is a challenge for the first time, and this might change at least the discussion in the German Bundestag quite a bit. But it's democracy, simple answer. And maybe if we have these people in the government, God forbid, in the parliament, maybe this will raise some political activity in the German population among the young, saying, okay, now there is something we have to do about. We have to fight back. And this is already seen in Germany. So maybe as bad as it is that we have the alternative for Germany possibly, most possibly in the next parliament, it might have an impact. And if I might finish with that, the other day in the New Yorker, which is a very smart magazine, one of the guys who wrote said, the intellectual, the experts, they're sometimes lazy. So after 1991, we thought, end of history, this will go on forever. There is no doubt it works just perfectly well. It didn't. Then we had the wave of populism coming over Europe, which is still lingering above us. But it didn't happen in France, it didn't happen in Holland, but we thought it's going on forever. What am I saying? It depends on us to change the trajectory. It doesn't come out of the blue. It's us, it's you, politicians, presidents, and civil society. This might sound very simple and very, we have heard this again. But maybe this is the first time, especially talking about my country. I'm 55. So far, it was a way up. This is the first time challenges within Germany and outside the EU. The EU seemed to be forever for us. The Brexit was absolutely out of the question. It's there. So things change, and I think the political engagement in Germany hopefully will rise also on that matter. And this is good, I think. We just shouldn't be too lazy in concerning Russia. We shouldn't be too lazy to challenge Russia and the Russian government with ideas instead of doing what they expect. And it's not very challenging what we're doing. Challenging in terms of changing the course. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reinhard. Thank you so much, distinguished panelists. I think these have been excellent insights, and we ourselves can sort of select and make the more comprehensive picture, also adding the book. For me to conclude very shortly, in the new normal, the dialogue still remains instrumental and important. I always say the dialogue is an asset and feature of the self-confident, because if we are self-confident, we are able to speak and to have a dialogue, even we might disagree on many things. Of course, the problem is that we are quite different if we speak about Western Russia. I think the problem is that there are more deeper fundamental problems or challenges, namely that as societal models, as societal organizations, we built on sort of different principles, and I think also the different international interests. That's why expectations management is important. We still might look in those small steps as we have been discussing here and also generally in Riga dialogue process, the transparency of the intentions, transparency of capabilities and activities to try to avoid negative spillover to undermine areas cooperation because there are still some of them. So some of my German colleagues actually use the word selective engagement or cooperative conflict or tension or managed confrontation, as we said it also here. Uncertainty remains, even though we may say as some kind of consolation, though, perhaps in 20 years' time we'll be calling these the good old days. We are still able to speak and to discuss things. So thank you once more to the partners, especially Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for this event, for putting together, Tobias, Regina, also to my own colleagues, Diana and Cynthia. Thanks to the authors of the books, not just this book, but also the books, because we try to have those afterthoughts every year. Very much once more thanks to the distinguished panelists, and of course to the audience, which came in such a big numbers. President, also it's always a pleasure, and of course the rest of the distinguished audience. So thank you so much. The book is served and the coffee is served as well. Thank you.